welcome to my channel. Subscribe, listen and enjoy my stories every day. I never thought I'd be the type to doubt my wife. Grace and I had been married for 15 years, through thick and thin, growing careers, and the ups and downs of raising our son, Oliver. It wasn't always easy, but whoever said marriage was supposed to be? We had our routines, our ways of making things work. But lately, something felt off. I couldn't put my finger on it, but an unease had crept into the ordinary fabric of our life. It started with small things, missed dinners, vague explanations about work projects that required late nights or weekend hours. At first, I shrugged it off. Grace had always been ambitious, and she was great at her job. But the signs piled up, subtle yet unignorable. Her phone was practically glued to her hand, always on silent mode, and she'd started guarding it like Fort Knox. She would smile at texts that popped up, a smile I hadn't seen in a long time. I told myself it was all in my head, a midlife paranoia that I needed to shake off. But one night, everything changed. It was a Thursday, and Grace had mentioned she'd be home late from another work dinner. I'd heard that excuse more times than I could count, but I let it slide. Oliver was at a friend's house, so I was alone, trying to distract myself from my swirling thoughts. That was when I saw it, her phone, sitting on the kitchen counter, lighting up with a new message. I knew I shouldn't look. I'd never been the kind of guy to invade her privacy. But the unease wouldn't let me ignore it. I reached for the phone, telling myself it was just to see if it was a work text, something innocent to soothe my worries. But when I unlocked the screen, my heart slammed in my chest. There it was, a message from someone named Eric, "Can't wait to see you again. Last night was incredible." In that moment, I couldn't breathe. The world went silent. My first instinct was disbelief. I was convinced I must have misinterpreted it. But the words were right there, as clear as day. There was no innocent explanation for what I was seeing. Grace, the woman I'd built a life with, the mother of my child, was meeting another man. My mind spun, struggling to process what this meant, what I was supposed to do next. Every instinct told me to confront her the moment she walked through the door, to demand answers. But something stopped me. If she'd been hiding this, what else had she hidden? If I confronted her, she'd probably deny it, spin some story. No, I needed proof, real proof that would leave no room for denial. For the next few days, I played the role of the unsuspecting husband. I acted as though everything was normal, even though every interaction with her felt like a dagger to the chest. Each morning, I watched her as she left the house, wondering if she was really heading to work or meeting with him instead. At night, I'd lie beside her, feeling like I was next to a stranger, my mind torn between anger and sadness. A week later, my patience paid off. Grace had gone to bed early, and once she was asleep, I took her phone again, this time to dig deeper. My hands trembled as I scrolled through her messages, my worst fears confirmed in every text. The conversations between her and Eric were anything but innocent. They'd met several times, sneaking around in hotel rooms, whispering sweet nothings that turned my stomach. And they weren't just co-workers, he was her escape, her secret. She was leading a double life, and I was the fool left in the dark. Rage boiled within me, but I kept it contained. I had to be smart about this, not let my emotions get the better of me. As much as I wanted to confront her right then and there, I knew she'd only lie, twist the truth. No, I needed to prepare, to gather every bit of evidence so she'd have no way out. Over the next few days, I started keeping track of every excuse she gave, every inconsistency in her stories. I logged it all, mentally piecing together the puzzle of her betrayal. I became a detective in my own marriage, scouring bank statements for unusual charges, looking up hotel receipts, even noting how she seemed to be texting a lot more when she was supposedly at work. The truth hit me like a sledgehammer. Grace hadn't just had a one-time fling, she'd built an entire relationship with this man. She was laughing, whispering, sharing moments with him that used to be ours. I felt the anger bubble up again, stronger this time, almost uncontrollable. But beneath it was something even darker, a kind of resolve I'd never felt before. If she thought she could betray me and get away with it, she was in for a surprise. The final straw came on a Friday night. Grace was working late again, and I'd finally had enough. I'd been watching her movements, her spending, her flimsy excuses. I could practically predict her lies before she told them. That night, I went into our shared accounts and moved all the money into a separate account, one she couldn't access. I wanted her to feel the betrayal as deeply as I did. Every dollar she'd leaned on, every bit of financial security we'd built together, I took it all, putting it somewhere she'd never reach. Then, I did one better. I crafted a message that would go out to everyone we knew, friends, family, even some of her coworkers. In that message, I laid out everything I'd discovered, sparing no detail, including screenshots of her texts with Eric. I wanted people to see the woman behind the mask, to know the real Grace. I wasn't going to let her control the narrative or hide behind lies. With my plans in place, I sat back and waited. It was only a matter of time before she'd come home, oblivious to the storm that was about to hit her. I felt a twisted satisfaction simmering beneath the heartbreak, the satisfaction of knowing she'd finally face the consequences of her actions. When Grace walked through the door that night, she barely looked at me. She was scrolling through her phone, smiling at whatever new message had just come in. She didn't see the cold fury in my eyes, the determination to make her feel every ounce of pain she'd caused. And as she looked up and caught my gaze, her smile faded, a glimmer of confusion in her eyes. It was time. Grace's eyes flickered with a hint of confusion as she looked at me that night, her smile fading. I held her gaze a little too long, my expression hardened, but I forced myself to keep calm. The temptation to confront her then and there was overwhelming, but I couldn't risk it, not when I was this close to having everything I needed. She gave a slight, nervous smile, shrugged, and walked past me into the kitchen. I clenched my fists, forcing myself to stay composed, to stick to the plan. Over the next few days, I continued acting like the loving, unsuspecting husband. I knew the truth now, and every second in her presence felt like a struggle, as if I was holding my breath, afraid I might explode. But if I was going to get my revenge, and I was, then I needed her to stay oblivious. I'd give her all the rope she needed to hang herself. Grace was careful, but she had her blind spots. I already had enough evidence from her texts to Eric, but I wanted more. I needed to be sure that when the truth came out, she'd have no way of wriggling out of it, no excuses to offer. So, I started going through her things when she wasn't around. I dug through her closet, her nightstand, and even the drawer she kept in the kitchen. I felt like a burglar in my own home, but I knew it was necessary. One evening, as she was out, working late, I found what I'd been looking for, a stack of receipts from restaurants and hotel stays, all in Eric City, none of which matched the dates or locations of her supposed business trips. I sifted through them, each one a small, sharp jab of betrayal, a testament to just how long she'd been lying to me. Every receipt confirmed what I'd already suspected: Grace's so-called work trips had been nothing more than a cover for her affair. One receipt in particular caught my attention, a hotel stay just a week ago, on the same night she'd told me she was meeting a client for dinner. I remembered that night well. She'd come home late, wearing a faint hint of a cologne I didn't recognize. I'd brushed it off then, convinced that I was being paranoid. But seeing the hotel receipt in my hand now, the reality hit me like a punch to the gut. She hadn't even bothered to hide it. Despite the hurt, I felt a strange sense of relief. The proof was there, solid and undeniable. Now, it was time to start laying out the pieces for my revenge. I wanted her to feel every bit of pain, every ounce of betrayal that she'd inflicted on me. The next step was the financials. Grace and I shared a few accounts, but she also had her own, one she'd insisted on keeping separate, for emergencies. I knew she kept most of her spending hidden there, and I suspected that some of her recent splurges were connected to her affair. It took some time, but eventually, I managed to get a look at her account history. As expected, there were transactions for high-end restaurants, jewelry stores, and designer boutiques, all things she'd never bought for me, or even mentioned. Then I found something else that made my blood run cold, a few transactions linked to a hotel rewards program. She was using points to cover some of her stays with him. It was like she'd been saving up for her affair, investing in it. I couldn't help but laugh at the absurdity of it. Grace, the woman I thought I knew so well, was spending more effort hiding her affair than she ever had putting work into our marriage. I made copies of everything, the texts, the receipts, even the points transactions. I knew it was overkill, but part of me wanted to be thorough, to make sure that when I finally confronted her, there'd be nothing she could deny. I wanted to strip away every bit of her deceit, to lay bare the ugly truth of what she'd done. With my evidence secured, I shifted to the next phase of my plan, the public reveal. Grace's life had always been about appearances, about making sure everyone saw her as the perfect wife, the perfect mother, the successful professional. She'd cultivated that image so carefully, so meticulously, and now I was going to tear it down. I crafted a message detailing everything I'd discovered, including screenshots of her texts with Eric, receipts of their rendezvous, and even photos of the jewelry she'd bought on our dime to impress him. But it wasn't enough to just send it out. I wanted her to experience the fallout, to feel the walls closing in as people realized the truth. So, I scheduled the message to be sent to her closest friends, her family, and even a few of her coworkers. I knew it would ruin her carefully constructed image, and that was exactly what I wanted. Grace had built her entire life on lies, and now those lies were about to come crashing down. A few days later, Grace went out for what she called a networking dinner. She kissed me on the cheek as she left, and I forced myself to return her smile, to act as though everything was normal. But as soon as she was out the door, I sprang into action. I logged into our shared bank accounts and transferred every penny into a separate account in my name. It wasn't just about the money, it was about making sure she knew I was done, that I wasn't going to be her safety net when her lies came to light. Once the money was secure, I made my final preparations. I set the scheduled message, time to go out just after midnight, and sat back, waiting. I knew Grace would be back later that night, oblivious to the trap I'd set for her. And when she came home, I'd be there, waiting for her, ready to watch her face when she realized just how thoroughly she'd been caught. The hours ticked by, each one bringing me closer to the moment I'd been waiting for. I tried to stay calm, to keep my mind focused on what I was about to do. Part of me still felt the sting of betrayal, the hurt of knowing that the woman I'd loved, the woman I'd built a life with, had torn it all apart for a fling. But there was another part of me that felt a twisted sense of satisfaction, a sense of justice in knowing that she was about to pay for her lies. Finally, I heard her car pull into the driveway. I took a deep breath, bracing myself, as I waited for her to come inside. She walked in, her usual carefree smile on her face, glancing down at her phone as she set her purse on the counter. She looked up, saw me watching her, and her smile faltered. "Hey, you're up late," she said, her tone casual, but there was a flicker of something in her eyes, maybe guilt, maybe just nerves. I returned her gaze, letting the silence stretch between us. "Yeah," I replied, my voice steady. "I thought we should talk." Her face grew pale, but she forced a smile. "Oh. About what?" "About us. About where things are headed." She laughed, nervously, trying to brush it off. "What do you mean?" "Everything's fine." I could see the fear creeping into her expression, the realization that something was wrong. She shifted uncomfortably, glancing back at her phone as though she could escape this conversation, this moment. "You sure about that?" I asked, unable to keep the bitterness out of my voice. She stammered, searching for words, her usual confidence slipping. "Of course. I mean, is something wrong? I just looked at her, letting her feel the weight of my gaze, the silent judgment. I knew I'd save my words for later, for when she'd see the full scope of what I knew, the extent of her lies. Grace's face was a mask of nervous confusion, her eyes darting around the room as if the answer to her discomfort was somewhere in the shadows. Her hand went instinctively to her phone, clutching it as though it could shield her from what was coming. I watched her carefully, taking in the small shifts in her expression as the silence hung between us, heavy and taut. "Sit down, Grace," I said, motioning to the couch. My voice was steady, but the undercurrent of tension was unmistakable. She hesitated, eyes narrowing slightly. "What's this about?" Her voice was a mixture of forced calm and barely contained irritation, a tone I'd grown familiar with over the last few months. But this time, there was something else, a tremor, a crack in her usual composure. "Just sit," I replied. She sat, perched on the edge of the couch as if ready to spring up at the first sign of trouble. I took my seat across from her, holding her gaze, waiting for the weight of the moment to settle in. She stared back at me, her discomfort growing as the silence stretched out, long and deliberate. "Are you going to tell me what's going on?" she finally snapped, her voice a bit too sharp, too defensive. "You tell me," I said, leaning forward. "What's going on, Grace? What's going on with us?" The flash of panic in her eyes was brief, but I caught it. She opened her mouth to respond, but closed it, quickly composing herself, trying to regain control. She tilted her head, giving me that familiar look of exasperation, the one she used when she thought I was overreacting or being unreasonable. "You're being cryptic, as usual," she said, forcing a laugh that sounded hollow. "If you have something to say, just say it." "Oh, I have something to say, all right," I replied, unable to hide the edge in my tone. "But I think you know exactly what this is about." For a moment, she looked genuinely confused, and I almost wondered if she'd convinced herself that her deception was hidden so deeply that it would never surface. But then I saw it, the flicker of realization, the dawning horror as her mind raced through possibilities. "Are you accusing me of something?" she asked, her voice rising defensively. I took a deep breath, steadying myself. This was the moment I'd been preparing for, but now that it was here, the emotions I tried to bury were clawing their way to the surface. "You're having an affair, Grace," I said, the words coming out colder and sharper than I'd intended. Her face went pale, the mask of feigned innocence slipping for just a moment before she forced a shocked expression onto her face. "What? That's insane. Where is this even coming from?" I held up my hand, stopping her mid-protest. "Don't bother, Grace. I know. I know everything." She froze, her mouth slightly open, eyes wide with panic. Her hand clutched her phone even tighter, her fingers digging into the case as if it could offer her an escape. "I found the texts," I continued, each word dropping like a stone in the stillness between us. "I know about the hotels, the dinners, all of it. You've been meeting him behind my back for months. Probably longer." Her face drained of color, and for a moment, she looked like she might faint. But then her survival instincts kicked in, and she straightened, the familiar defiance returning to her eyes. "This is ridiculous," she spat, trying to regain control. "You're just paranoid. I don't know what you think you saw, but you're blowing things out of proportion." "Blowing things out of proportion?" I echoed, my voice low, dangerous. "I have screenshots, receipts, and dates that match up with every time you lied to me. Do you really think you can talk your way out of this?" For the first time, I saw the cracks in her composure deepen. Her hand trembled slightly, her gaze flitting around the room as if searching for a lifeline. I don't know what to say," she stammered, her voice barely a whisper. "How about the truth?" I said, my tone sharp. "You owe me that much." She looked down, her shoulders slumping, the fight slowly draining out of her. "All right," she murmured, almost inaudible. Fine. I made a mistake. I shouldn't have. A mistake? I interrupted, my voice filled with a cold fury. A mistake is forgetting an anniversary. A mistake is missing a date. What you did was a betrayal. You don't just mistake your way into hotel rooms with another man. Her face twisted, anger flaring up as if she was the one wronged. It's not that simple, okay? You're not exactly blameless in all of this. Oh, really? I laughed, incredulous. So now this is my fault. She looked up, meeting my gaze with a cold, almost contemptuous glare. You were always working, always too busy for me. I was lonely, and you were never there. I needed someone who actually cared. Don't you dare try to justify this, I replied, my voice shaking. Don't you dare turn this around on me. I was working for us, for our family. I thought you supported me. I thought we were in this together. She scoffed, crossing her arms. Together? You were never around. And even when you were 1,000 miles away. You think a few text messages and a couple of dinners make up for that? For a moment, the anger in her eyes flickered, replaced by something I hadn't seen in a long time, guilt. She looked away, her gaze falling to her hands as she fidgeted with her phone, the silence stretching between us like a chasm. I could see her struggling, searching for a way to salvage this, to somehow claw back some semblance of control. I'm sorry, she whispered, the words barely audible. Sorry. I replied, a bitter laugh escaping me. Sorry doesn't cut it, Grace. Sorry doesn't even come close. She looked up, her eyes filled with tears, the anger melting into desperation. I didn't want it to be this way, she murmured, her voice trembling. I never meant to hurt you. I stared at her, feeling the weight of her words but also feeling the deep, festering wound that her betrayal had left. I had once loved this woman, trusted her with everything. Now, I could hardly recognize the person sitting before me. Then why did you do it? I asked, my voice softer, almost pleading. Why throw away everything we had? She shook her head, wiping away a tear. I don't know, she whispered. It just happened. One thing led to another, and I couldn't stop. Couldn't stop, I repeated, the words tasting bitter. You didn't want to stop, Grace. That's the truth, isn't it? She didn't answer, her silence confirming what I already knew. The woman I thought I knew, the life we'd built together, had all been a facade, a lie that had crumbled the moment I uncovered her deceit. Taking a deep breath, I stood up, the weight of the decision I'd made settling over me like a cold shroud. This is over, Grace, I said, my voice calm but final. Whatever we had, it's done. Her head snapped up, panic flashing in her eyes. Wait, no. Don't say that. We can work through this. I know I messed up, but I can make it right. I can. It's too late, I interrupted, my tone unyielding. I'm done. She tried to stand, reaching for me, but I stepped back, my gaze hardening. Don't make this harder than it already is. Her hand dropped, her expression one of desperate resignation. She looked away, tears streaming down her face, her shoulders slumped in defeat. In that moment, she looked so small, so vulnerable, and I almost felt a pang of pity. But then I remembered everything I'd uncovered, the lies, the deceit, the nights she'd spent with him while I'd been here, waiting, trusting. That pity vanished, replaced by a cold resolve. I'll be gone by the morning, I said, my voice low, final. And you can explain everything to everyone else. They're going to know, Grace. They're all going to know exactly who you are. Her eyes widened, the shock evident as she realized the full extent of what I meant. She opened her mouth to protest, but no words came. She simply sat there, staring at me, as if seeing me for the first time. Without another word, I turned and left the room, the sound of her quiet sobs following me down the hall. As I closed the door behind me, a strange sense of peace settled over me. The storm had passed, and the wreckage was all that remained. Now, it was time for her to face the consequences of her choices, alone. I spent the night on the couch, the silence of the empty house pressing in on me. Grace's sobs had eventually faded, replaced by a cold, tense quiet. I lay there, staring at the ceiling, my mind swirling with fragments of what had just happened. I should have felt relieved, even victorious, but instead, a hollow ache had settled in my chest. I had been preparing for this moment for weeks, meticulously collecting evidence, orchestrating every detail of my plan. But now that it was over, the anger that had sustained me felt like it was draining out, leaving only emptiness in its wake. All that remained was a dull, gnawing sadness, a feeling I hadn't expected and didn't want to acknowledge. At dawn, I rose from the couch, exhausted but resolute. I gathered a few things and put them into a small duffel bag, taking only what I'd need. I didn't have a clear plan, but I knew I needed to get away, put as much distance as I could between myself and this shattered life. As I turned to leave, I paused, glancing back at the closed bedroom door where Grace was still sleeping. Part of me wanted to go in, to say goodbye, or maybe to say something that would give this ending a sense of closure. But what could I say that would mean anything now? I left quietly, stepping out into the cold morning air, the first light of dawn casting long shadows over the empty street. I had no destination in mind, just an overwhelming urge to escape. I drove aimlessly, the radio silent, my mind replaying everything that had happened, every word she'd said. But as I tried to let go, memories began to surface, the day we'd first met, the nights we'd spent talking until dawn, the promises we'd made. These were the fragments of a life that was now gone, and with each memory, the ache in my chest grew sharper. By midday, I found myself at a small motel on the edge of town. I checked in, threw my bag on the floor, and sat on the edge of the bed, staring at the empty room. The plan had been to cut her off, expose her, leave her to face the shame and the consequences alone. But now, alone in that unfamiliar room, the enormity of what I'd done began to settle over me. I'd wanted revenge, yes, but I hadn't counted on the emptiness that followed. And I hadn't expected the flood of memories, the weight of all the years we'd spent together, pressing down on me with a suffocating force. I stayed in that motel room for 3 days, barely eating or sleeping, wrestling with my own mind. The thought of going back to that empty house filled me with dread, but the thought of moving on, of starting over, felt equally impossible. And then, on the morning of the 4th day, I got a call. It was Grace's sister, her voice tense, each word clipped and hurried. "You need to come home," she said, her tone wavering. "Why?" I replied, my voice colder than I'd intended. There was a long pause, and when she spoke again, her voice was choked with emotion. "It's Grace. She's gone." The words didn't register at first. It felt like I was hearing them from a distance, as though someone else were living this moment, not me. "What do you mean, gone?" I finally managed, my voice barely a whisper. She took her own life," her sister said, struggling to keep herself together. "The neighbors heard the gunshot. They found her this morning." The phone slipped from my hand, clattering to the floor as the full weight of her words hit me. Grace was gone. The woman I had loved, hated, resented, and betrayed, she was gone. My chest tightened, a crushing pain filling the hollow space that had been there only moments before. I stumbled back, my mind reeling, the room spinning around me. My knees buckled, and I sank to the floor, gasping for air as grief, guilt, and regret flooded over me in an overwhelming torrent. I'd wanted her to suffer, to feel the pain she'd caused me, but I'd never imagined it would end like this. I'd never wanted this. I sat on the motel floor, numb, as the memories came rushing back in a relentless wave. Every smile, every laugh, every promise we'd made to each other, they all felt like ghosts, haunting me, accusing me. I had loved her once, truly and deeply, and in the end, my anger had destroyed the only thing that had ever mattered. Somehow, I made it back to our house, the place that had once been our home, now nothing more than a monument to everything we'd lost. The police had come and gone, leaving only silence and the faint scent of her perfume lingering in the air. I wandered through the empty rooms, my footsteps echoing in the stillness, each step a reminder of the life we'd built together and the life I'd torn apart. In our bedroom, I found a note on the nightstand, her handwriting shaky but unmistakable. It was short, barely a few sentences, but each word cut me deeper than any wound I'd ever known. "I'm sorry," she'd written. "I never meant to hurt you. I loved you, even when I didn't show it. I wish things could have been different." I collapsed onto the bed, clutching the note in my hands as the tears finally came, hot and unrelenting. I cried for her, for the life we'd shared, for the family we'd tried to build. And I cried for the part of myself that I'd lost along the way, the part that had once believed in love, forgiveness, and the possibility of redemption. As the hours passed, I lay there, numb and broken, replaying every moment of our last conversation, every harsh word I'd thrown at her. I'd wanted to hurt her, to make her feel the pain she'd caused me, but in the end, I'd only hurt myself. My revenge had come at a price I could never have anticipated, and now, it was too late to take it back. The days that followed blurred together in a haze of regret and grief. I went through the motions, attended the funeral, faced her family's anger and sorrow, but I felt as though I were moving through a fog, a world that no longer felt real. The life I'd known, the woman I'd loved and lost, it was all gone, leaving only the ashes of a once bright flame. And as I sat alone in our empty house, the silence pressing in on me, I realized that I would carry this burden for the rest of my life. There was no undoing what had been done, no way to turn back the clock. I had sought revenge, and I had found it, but in the end, it had cost me everything.